Alright, well, I'm Gerard, and the book I'll be reviewing today is American and British Technology in the 19th Century. This book was written in 1962. The author's name was H.J. Habakkuk. At the time, he was a well-known economist who taught at Cambridge University. This book was born out of a series of lectures that he gave at Columbia University, and the purpose of which was to examine the rate and composition of technological progress in industry, viewed sort of through an economic lens during the 19th century in both Britain and America. What initially he found was that American industrial processes were becoming mechanized at a much faster rate than their British counterparts, and this was kind of surprising because Britain was the home of the Industrial Revolution. And the popular answer from most historians who didn't have an economics background was that America was suffering from a labor shortage at that time, and that forced business owners to look toward machines to replace that labor. Britain didn't really have the same labor issues and didn't really mechanize quite as fast. This was kind of his main thesis, and he spent the rest of his book critically evaluating it. Part of the reason that there was a labor scarcity in America was due to the strength of agriculture. At that time, agriculture was a very popular career or lifestyle option. You were your own boss. You got to provide for your family. It was sort of the American dream at that point in time, and it drove people away from the factories. Another plus in the favor of agriculture was that land at that time was very affordable. You could buy it for about $1.25 an acre from the federal government, which even back then was very affordable, and it was very productive. The land yielded a lot of crops. America was also very spread out at that time, so if there was demand, they had trouble. It was hard to move your family, in search of jobs, so people mainly just stayed where they were. Habakkuk found that labor scarcity raised the cost of unskilled labor, manual type labor, more than the cost of skilled labor, and this encouraged practices like specialization, where you became proficient at one specific task. Again, this led to machines being brought out to get the most out of what was back then a smaller workforce. This also affected the capital side of the business too. Americans tended to work their machines longer and harder, and they were less durable, so they had to replace them more often. But this was due to sort of an expectation in America that you would use your machine up, and by the time you were done with it, there would be a better machine waiting for you to purchase. In the 19th century, America was a small, isolated, and rural country. Businesses operated in a very small area, but as communication and technology improved, they found that they could expand their markets, and this led to a desire to increase production, which ultimately led to more machines again. During the 19th century, embargoes and tariffs on British goods were lifted after the War of 1812, and this allowed American factory owners to buy British machines, so you could theoretically substitute the cheaper British labor that was used to make the machine for the more expensive American labor. In Britain, however, agriculture was not as productive, and factories had a far easier time recruiting labor. Labor was more responsive in Britain. It was easier to find unskilled labor than skilled labor. Britain at that time was suffering from more of a capital shortage. It was hard to get external financing from a bank, say, to buy a large fixed asset. So what happened in Britain was it forced sort of a de-innovation. Britain tended to hold on to their machines for a longer time. They would try to get the most out of them, and if they bought a new one, it would probably be the same type of machine. Again, later in the 19th century, Britain was still a very rigid and bureaucratic society. Business was not a popular career option. You would rather be a lawyer or a doctor, and it sort of siphoned off kind of the top talent, if you will. And there was also a cultural tendency to make just enough to become wealthy, and at a certain level you would make a certain amount of money, and then it was hands off. So basically they just wanted to be rich, and then they didn't want to do anything else. And really what kind of crippled Britain was demand for their product kind of slowed as American and other countries like Germany, they started flooding the marketplace with their goods too. And their demand slowed right as a bunch of new technology was being implemented that Britain really didn't invest in. So they were kind of caught flat-footed. I thought that the subject matter was challenging. I mean, this is kind of an esoteric subject, but it was definitely interesting to learn about how businesses, ran in the 19th century. It was quite a bit different from how they run now. Well, it was just a lot simpler, and the concerns that they had were much different from the ones that we have today. I was a little disappointed with the title. I thought it would be a book that was more about the actual inventions that saved labor. Some of the they mentioned them a little bit. The loom was a popular topic in this book. How it saved labor and stuff. But the book was really more concerned about how do we save, or what's the economic imperative for saving labor. This book was definitely written for economists. Habakkuk definitely wrote it for his peers. So it was harder for someone. I don't have an economics background. It was harder for me to kind of get into the book. It took me a couple times. I had to read it through just to kind of understand what I was reading. There were a lot of economic terms and theories that he used. The writing style I was not a huge fan of. The chapters were way too long. There were only 6 chapters in a 200-page book. So they were definitely too long, and his key points didn't flow very well together. He kind of would go on a subject, and then he would veer off on a tangent, and then he would return back to the subject. So it was kind of hard to keep track of where he was going. The reviews he had from his peers, I was able to find a couple of economists that reviewed his work, and their reviews were kind of mixed. They applauded his effort because he didn't have a whole lot of data to work from since it was so long ago. But they thought overall it was a good attempt, at a tough subject. And then, how is the book related to class? Well, one thing that I learned was, over and over again in the book, America really was open to innovation. They really wanted to find the latest and greatest thing. They were very open. In Britain, on the other hand, they were suspicious. Unions were a big component in Britain at that time. They were very suspicious of anything that saved labor. And I don't know if this had anything to do with it, but Britain, they were way ahead of everybody at the beginning of the century. But by the end of the century, America had pretty much caught them and was gonna go way past them in the 20th century. So I guess as a final thought, our culture, we can have the power to influence where we go, and it's not maybe just today and tomorrow, but it could be a century down the road. So.